June 5, 1944, North Wither Airfield, England. Before dawn, the airfield buzzed with activity as paratroopers prepared for an unprecedented mission over Nazi-occupied France. Teams of pathfinders moved steadily toward rows of waiting Douglas C-47 Skytrains, their olive-drab fuselages marked with chalked identification numbers. Captain Frank Lillyman glanced at his wristwatch. 2150 hours. The first stick of paratroopers from the 52nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, a total of 18 men, were ready to board. They were assigned to drop ahead of the main force by approximately 30 minutes, tasked with establishing the initial guiding markers on French soil using lights and radio transmitters. Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch assumed command of one of the C-47s, gripping the control yoke as the aircraft engines rumbled to life. 3 planes were scheduled to depart in staggered 5-minute intervals, each carrying specialized pathfinder teams to pre-selected coordinates behind the formidable Atlantic Wall. The men were unaware that this night would initiate the largest airborne assault in history, a campaign in which confusion and rapid action would prove more decisive than precise formation maneuvers. The German military had fortified the Normandy coastline into a near-impenetrable barrier. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's defensive plan relied on the rapid deployment of mobile reserves positioned just behind the coastal defenses. If the Allies could sever these routes, entire defensive sectors would crumble. The 91st Air Landing Division and the 6th Fulcham Jaeger Regiment held strategic positions across the Cotentown Peninsula, comprising roughly 7,000 troops controlling vital bridges, causeways, and junctions linking Utah Beach to inland France. These forces were overseen by General Wilhelm Fall, headquartered at the Château de Bernaville, positioned to respond swiftly to any Allied incursion. At 140 miles per hour, C-47 Skytrains ascended through the English darkness, each aircraft fully loaded at approximately 26,900 pounds. Lieutenant Colonel Crouch piloted the first of 822 planes that would carry the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions into occupied territory. His aircraft transported 18 pathfinders equipped with specialized devices, including Eureka radar beacons capable of sending signals to Rebecca receivers aboard the incoming transports, and holophane lights arranged in specific patterns for visibility from 2,000 feet above ground. Precision was critical. The intended drop zones were roughly 1,000 by 600 yards, allowing pilots only 15 seconds to locate the correct site at 120 miles per hour ground speed. Even a 5-degree navigation error could scatter paratroopers across miles of hostile terrain. At Greenham Common Airfield, Major General Maxwell Taylor addressed officers of the 101st Airborne Division. A West Point graduate of the class of 1922 with combat experience in Sicily and Italy, Taylor emphasized that success in airborne operations relied less on coordinated unit movement and more on the ability of dispersed soldiers to act decisively and aggressively. For the 101st, objectives included capturing 4 causeway exits linking Utah Beach to the French mainland. The surrounding fields had been deliberately flooded by German engineers to channel advancing troops into predetermined kill zones. Securing these exits was essential. Failure would leave thousands stranded under concentrated enemy fire on the beaches.
Meanwhile, aboard C-47, number 4293095, Lieutenant Thomas Meehan reviewed his unit's objectives with 17 paratroopers from Easy Company, 56th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Their mission was to seize wooden bridges near Leopold and secure the second causeway by 0630 hours. These men had undergone 18 months of intensive training, transforming from civilians into elite airborne forces. Despite their preparation, fate would intervene. At 11:12 hours, intense anti-aircraft fire struck C-47 429-3095, tearing through the fuselage. The plane spiraled uncontrollably into the Norman countryside near Beauzeville-Opel, resulting in the deaths of all 5 crew members and 17 paratroopers, including Lieutenant Meehan and his entire command element. This night marked the beginning of an operation that would test the limits of airborne warfare and demonstrate how strategy, chaos, and courage could converge to overcome even the most formidable fortifications. On June 6, 1944, the American airborne forces moved across the English Channel in organized formations known as serrals. Each serral consisted of 9 transport aircraft, divided into 3 elements of 3 planes each, maintaining a spacing of roughly 1,000 feet. Specific drop zones had been allocated to each unit, and Pathfinder teams were tasked with activating radio beacons to guide the main parachute infantry formations. The entire operation demanded precision, yet the execution relied heavily on ideal conditions. Over Normandy, however, conditions were anything but optimal. A dense cloud layer hovered at 1,500 feet, obscuring visual navigation landmarks, while pockets of ground fog reduced horizontal visibility to less than 1 mile. German radar installations, monitoring from distances up to 50 miles, detected the incoming transports, allowing anti-aircraft defenses to prepare across the peninsula. At 12:15 a.m., Captain Lillemann's Pathfinder unit deployed over Drop Zone A, located west of Sainte-Marie-Église. Within 10 minutes, their Eureka beacon began transmitting on the assigned frequencies, intended to guide the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment to the correct landing point. Yet, interference from scattered clouds and hostile fire had already begun to disrupt the planned formations. Only a single Pathfinder team of 5 successfully landed within a 1-mile radius of their target. Staff Sergeant John Ray led the 3rd Squad of Company F, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. At 24 years old, Ray hailed from Glendora, California, and had earned his jump wings at Fort Benning. His squad specialized in nocturnal operations, practicing regrouping procedures using coded auditory signals and verification passwords. A paratrooper would call flash in the dark, with the appropriate response being thunder, confirming friendly identification.
Ray's C-47 dropped its stick between 00 and 030 hours, approximately 7 miles away from Drop Zone N. The sergeant descended into 3 feet of water, his parachute dragging him through a flooded field. Mud had caused the release mechanism to jam, forcing Ray to cut himself free with his jump knife. He then spent 4 hours navigating the marshlands to locate members of his squad. By first light, he had gathered 3 of his men, along with 14 paratroopers from various other regiments. Dispersed soldiers would soon coalesce into functional combat units by necessity rather than pre-established organization. By 1:40 a.m., the primary serials neared the Cotentin Peninsula at an altitude of approximately 1,500 feet. German anti-aircraft batteries unleashed fire from 88mm and 20mm guns, producing continuous streams of tracer rounds and explosive bursts. Pilots reacted instinctively, climbing or diving to evade incoming fire, which shattered formation integrity. Aircraft, once spaced by hundreds of feet, were now separated by miles. Navigators lost visual reference to lead planes, while radio silence prohibited coordinated corrections. Jumpmasters had to rely on elapsed time from the coastline to estimate aircraft positions. Green marker lights were activated at pre-calculated intervals, but these were based on dead reckoning rather than visible landmarks. Paratroopers exited their aircraft into uncertainty, trusting that below lay the intended French territory rather than the English Channel. Private John Steele of Company F, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed over Sainte-Marie-Église at 1:15 a.m. The town square, illuminated by a burning building, silhouetted descending paratroopers, exposing them to enemy machine gun fire. During the Normandy airborne operations, Private Steele experienced a perilous landing when his parachute became entangled on a church steeple, leaving him suspended approximately 30 feet above the town square. For the next 2 hours, he remained immobile, forced to observe German troops firing on his fellow paratroopers as they descended to the ground. Steele sustained a foot injury from shrapnel, but managed to feign death until enemy soldiers eventually cut him down and took him prisoner. He would later escape after the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment's 3rd Battalion liberated the town in the early hours of D-Day at 0430. This marked the first French settlement to be freed on that day.
Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, in command of the 3rd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed roughly 2 miles away from his designated drop zone near Carentan. Despite the scattered landing, Cole quickly organized an ad hoc force of 75 paratroopers drawn from various units and advanced toward their objective, navigating through pockets of German resistance. By 0630, Cole's small contingent reached a heavily defended German position guarding the highway bridge in Carentan. The enemy fortifications consisted of 4 reinforced concrete bunkers bolstered by mortars and machine guns. Conventional infantry tactics would have dictated a coordinated battalion-level assault on such a stronghold. Cole, however, had only 75 soldiers equipped with rifles, grenades, and a single bazooka with 3 rockets. Assessing the situation, he ordered a direct bayonet charge across 250 yards of exposed terrain. The audacity of the maneuver proved decisive. German defenders, anticipating an organized assault, were psychologically unprepared for the ferocity of the assaulting paratroopers, many charging with fixed bayonets while screaming. The bridge was secured, though at a steep cost. 29 men were killed and 43 wounded. Cole would later be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership and courage during the engagement, having died 3 months later in Holland. On the German side, General of Artillery Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps from Saint-Lô, faced a complex and confusing battlefield. A seasoned officer with experience on the Eastern Front, where he had lost a leg at Stalingrad, Marx was well-versed in mobile defensive strategies and maintained reserves specifically to respond to Allied landings. At roughly 120 hours into the operation, he began receiving reports of parachute drops scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. Paratroopers were reported in numerous locations, including Carentan, St. Gilles, Montaberg, Pont-l'Abbé, and over 20 other points simultaneously. The dispersed nature of these reports created a tactical dilemma. It was unclear whether these were isolated commando raids, diversionary actions, or part of a main invasion. Committing his reserves against the scattered forces could leave the coastal defenses vulnerable, while holding back could allow the airborne troops to consolidate and penetrate deeper into German lines. Without accurate intelligence, Marx instructed local commanders to contain each landing site while keeping reserves mobile, a prudent decision given the limited information. Unbeknownst to him, the apparent randomness was not a deliberate tactic, but rather the result of scattered American drops, which inadvertently created a level of confusion and paralysis far exceeding what any planned operation could have achieved. Meanwhile, Technical Sergeant Frank McKee, serving with Headquarters Company of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, landed in a walled garden near Turkeville at 1:45 hours. Tasked with transporting SCR-300 radio equipment essential for coordinating battalion-level operations, McKee found himself isolated in complete darkness, enclosed by 8-foot walls, highlighting the extreme hazards faced by communications personnel during airborne operations. Gunshots erupted from multiple directions as McKee attempted to establish contact via radio, but his calls went unanswered. His encrypted codes were rendered ineffective in the absence of other operators. For 3 continuous hours, McKee defended his landing site using his M1 Garand, successfully eliminating 2 German soldiers who had approached to investigate. At first light, he encountered a gathering of 19 paratroopers near a crossroads. None were members of his original unit, and most had lost critical gear during their descent. By virtue of controlling the sole operational radio, McKee assumed the role of provisional leader. He promptly communicated with Division Command at 0830 hours, reporting their location and seeking directives. The orders were straightforward: advance toward Poopville and engage any enemy forces encountered.
Under McKee's leadership, the ad hoc assembly of paratroopers moved toward the village, intercepting German patrols along the way and capturing 32 prisoners. By 1100 hours, they arrived in Poopville and linked up with elements advancing from Utah Beach. McKee's radio became the main conduit for coordination, enabling artillery support and medical evacuation between airborne and amphibious units. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel William Ekman oversaw the 55th Parachute Infantry Regiment's drop, which proved highly effective. Despite challenging weather and enemy fire, 75% of the regiment's paratroopers landed within a 1-mile radius of Drop Zone O near St. Mary Glees. Ekman succeeded in assembling 600 troops within 2 hours, a remarkable consolidation given the circumstances. This cohesion allowed the regiment to carry out its operational objectives efficiently. The 3rd Battalion captured Searle at 0430 hours. The 2nd Battalion secured the bridge at Lafayette, and the 1st Battalion established blockades preventing German reinforcements from Montebarg. However, this success brought additional difficulties. The regiment had to defend a 6-mile front with only 600 men, facing enemy forces outnumbering them 10-1. Ekman placed emphasis on strong points at key locations, relying on isolated units to maintain positions until relieved. Private First Class Leonard Budgo commanded a small roadblock north of St. Marie Glees with 7 fellow paratroopers. At 0800 hours, German reconnaissance vehicles approached, prompting Goodgull's squad to destroy the lead vehicle using a bazooka, effectively obstructing the road. For 12 hours, his unit withstood repeated German probing attacks while facing severe ammunition shortages. They scavenged weapons from fallen enemies, including MG-42 machine guns, and turned them against advancing German forces. Relief finally arrived at 2000 hours in the form of Sherman tanks from the 746th Tank Battalion, moving from Utah Beach. During the engagement, Goodgull's squad expended over 2,000 rounds, deployed 14 grenades, and successfully prevented German armor from reaching St. Mary Glees during critical morning hours. The drop zones assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division were located west of the Murderay River. While aerial reconnaissance suggested stable ground, the terrain concealed extensive marshlands. Many paratroopers landed in water ranging from waist to head height. Equipment bundles weighing up to 140 pounds trapped some soldiers underwater, resulting in fatalities before harnesses could be released. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Shanley, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, descended into flooded terrain at approximately 0220 hours, landing in water that reached waist depth. In the chaos of the drop, his battalion dispersed over an area of nearly 20 square miles. Over the next 5 hours, Shanley managed to gather a small group of 48 paratroopers drawn from multiple units, forming an improvised defensive contingent. This ad hoc force was tasked with holding Hill 30, located west of the Murderay River, a position of strategic importance. For 3 consecutive days, Shanley's men repelled repeated German assaults, successfully preventing the enemy from outflanking the main positions of the 82nd Airborne Division. During this period, the unit faced complete isolation. Communications with Division Command were non-existent, and there was no possibility of resupply for ammunition or medical provisions. 37 wounded soldiers were confined to a converted Norman farmhouse, serving as a field aid station. Technician 5th grade Eugene Darnell acted as the sole medical personnel, relying on scavenged German medical supplies and sterilized cloth for bandages. When morphine supplies were exhausted, Darnell was left to provide only comfort, holding the hands of men who succumbed to otherwise untreatable injuries. Meanwhile, Brigadier General James Gavin, Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne, landed with the 58th Regiment at 0230 hours. At 37 years old, Gavin was the youngest general officer in the U.S. Army at that time, having earned rapid promotion for his leadership of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment in Sicily and Italy. Gavin touched down in an orchard near Lafayette, initially assembling a small team of 12 paratroopers, before gradually consolidating scattered elements into a force approaching 300 men, drawn from 6 different battalions. Gavin's focus soon turned to the Lafayette Bridge, the only route across the Meurthe River suitable for vehicle passage. The Americans held the east bank, but German forces occupied the west bank with fortified positions, supported by machine guns and mortars. Lacking heavy weaponry, the paratroopers faced severe challenges in mounting an assault across the narrow causeway. Over the next 2 days, control of the bridge shifted repeatedly as troops from both sides engaged in intense combat. Repeated charges into concentrated enemy fire, combined with counterattacks by German self-propelled artillery, left the surrounding water filled with casualties, to the point where bodies created rudimentary barriers. On June 9th, Gavin personally directed the final offensive that secured the bridge definitively. The operation resulted in 254 American casualties, but successfully established a corridor for armored units to reinforce the isolated 82nd Airborne elements positioned west of the Meurthe. Opposing these actions, Major General Wilhelm Folly commanded the German 91st Air Landing Division from his headquarters at Château de Berneville. Folly, a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, possessed thorough knowledge of airborne tactics and had strategically deployed his units to counter potential parachute landings. In the early hours of June 6th, around 0400, Folly was returning from Rennes, where the German High Command had organized a military exercise. His route passed through zones already impacted by American drops. Near Pickville, a patrol under Lieutenant Malcolm Braun from the 3rd Battalion, 58th Regiment, quickly established a roadblock to impede enemy movement. As General Oberst Friedrich Fee von Pfalz's vehicle sped along the road, paratroopers opened fire with automatic weapons from concealed positions. The car collided violently with a wall, and Pfalz was killed instantly, succumbing to multiple gunshot wounds. He became the first German general to die during the D-Day invasion. His sudden loss left the central sector of the German command without coordinated leadership, weakening their ability to respond effectively to the Allied landings and allowing dispersed American airborne units to carry out their missions with reduced opposition. The 101st Airborne Division had been tasked with securing Causeway 2, which required controlling the western approach through Pooperville Village. At 500 hours, First Lieutenant Eugene Dance of the 500th Parachute Infantry Regiment assembled a platoon of 26 paratroopers near the outskirts of the village. Intelligence indicated roughly 40 German defenders entrenched in prepared positions. Conventional military doctrine would have called for an assault with the full company strength supported by heavy weapons. Instead, Dance split his platoon into 2 separate squads to attack from both northern and southern directions simultaneously. The engagement began at 5:30 hours. Grenades were deployed through occupied windows, and soldiers advanced house by house, systematically clearing rooms with small arms and bayonets. During the operation, Sergeant Elmer Murray entered the local church expecting to encounter German observers in the steeple. Instead, he found approximately 60 French civilians sheltering from the fighting. Murray quickly established a guard to protect the civilians while his team resumed clearing the village. By 800 hours, Dance's platoon had gained control over Pooperville. The unit had taken 18 German prisoners and neutralized an estimated 20 enemy combatants. Shortly after, at 8:15 hours, elements of the 8th Infantry Regiment advancing from Utah Beach arrived in the village, completing the link-up between airborne and seaborne forces.
Despite having lost half their men and lacking the support weapons originally allocated for the mission, Dance's platoon had successfully secured the crucial causeway exit, a vital route for Allied movements inland. Meanwhile, a threat persisted from artillery positions at San Martin de Varville. 4 105mm German howitzers stationed there had the capability to inflict severe damage on landing craft approaching Utah Beach. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was assigned the task of neutralizing this battery before the amphibious assault commenced. At 4:30 a.m., Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers led a small group of 15 paratroopers toward the target. Summers, a former coal miner from West Virginia, had earned recognition for his exceptional marksmanship and tactical acumen. Upon reaching the battery, Summers' team discovered that the guns had already been relocated by German forces several days prior in anticipation of the airborne assault. Although the artillery pieces were gone, the concrete bunkers remained, equipped with machine gun emplacements capable of threatening advancing American forces. The operation highlighted the adaptability of U.S. paratroopers under unexpected conditions and their ability to accomplish objectives despite incomplete intelligence and limited resources. Sergeant Summers executed a remarkable solo assault on German fortifications, an action that would become a defining episode in airborne warfare. Over the course of approximately 2 hours, he systematically engaged enemy positions, eliminating 31 German soldiers. The intensity of his sustained fire caused his Thompson submachine gun barrel to become so hot that it burned through his leather gloves. Throughout the assault, Private John Camion followed closely, supplying ammunition under continuous enemy fire, repeatedly risking his own life to ensure Summers' weapon remained operational.
When Summers' Thompson jammed from overheating, Camion provided his personal firearm and continued running ammunition to him, even using a captured German MP-40 to maintain the offensive. By 0700 hours, Summers had successfully neutralized 15 bunkers without assistance. The surviving German troops abandoned their positions and retreated toward Carentan. Having fired over 700 rounds and deployed 28 grenades in relentless action, Summers collapsed from exhaustion. For his extraordinary efforts, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, though eyewitnesses contended that his valor warranted the Medal of Honor. Summers survived the war, but never fully overcame the psychological scars from that day. The German 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment represented an elite airborne unit specially trained to counter parachute assaults. Its commander, Major Friedrich von der, a veteran paratrooper himself since 1941, understood both the strengths and vulnerabilities of airborne operations. Anticipating an Allied attempt to seize the strategically significant Carentan Road junction, he arranged his forces in a defensive perimeter around the town. Von der's plan emphasized mobile counterattack teams reinforced by mortars and pre-registered machine gun positions covering the most probable drop zones. Between 0000 and 0015 hours, Von der received reports of American parachute landings to the north and east of Carentan. He immediately dispatched reconnaissance units while holding his main combat strength in reserve. Initial intelligence indicated that American forces were dispersed across a wide area of roughly 30 kilometers, showing no concentrated formation. Von der faced a tactical dilemma: were these scattered troops pathfinders preceding a larger assault, diversionary elements, or disoriented soldiers from other operations? He opted for aggressive reconnaissance, sending platoons to locate American positions while preserving his core units. Despite his cautious approach, the fragmented American paratroopers rapidly organized into impromptu fighting groups faster than German patrols could identify and eliminate them. By dawn, Von der's regiment was under attack from multiple directions by forces whose numbers remained unknown. The elite Fallschirmjäger units, trained for controlled offensive operations, instead found themselves in a disordered defensive engagement similar to what they had been trained to inflict on their adversaries. Meanwhile, Technician 4th grade George Koskimaki, assigned as a radio operator with the 101st Airborne Division's headquarters company, experienced a misdrop approximately 5 miles from his intended landing site at 0145 hours. Landing in an apple orchard, his SCR-300 radio remained functional, but its antenna was damaged during the descent. For 2 hours, he improvised repairs while evading German patrols, ultimately constructing a makeshift antenna from the remnants of a destroyed telephone pole. By 0400 hours, Koskimaki had re-established partial communication with division headquarters. His orchard position quickly evolved into a temporary command hub as other officers arrived seeking intelligence and coordination. Koskimaki relayed information between isolated units, facilitated ammunition resupply requests, and provided the only dependable updates on German positions for 6 consecutive hours. When German artillery targeted his transmissions around 1000 hours, he relocated 5 times, maintaining uninterrupted communication throughout the morning.
During the initial day of the invasion, the radio operator logged 147 outgoing messages and received 89, forming the crucial communications framework that transformed the initial disorder into a coordinated operational effort. The death of Captain Thomas Meehan aboard aircraft 42-900-3095 left Easy Company of the 56th Regiment without leadership at a pivotal moment. Lieutenant Harry Welsh, as the senior surviving officer, immediately assumed command. Welsh touched down approximately 2 miles from Drop Zone C, along with 7 members of his platoon. As they progressed toward Causeway 2, Welsh gathered dispersed paratroopers, eventually forming a unit of 43 soldiers drawn from 9 separate companies. These men had not trained together, and most were missing essential equipment lost during the descent. Welsh had only a single map, 2 radios, and no heavy weaponry at his disposal. At 0530 hours, this improvised force encountered German defensive positions guarding the approach to Causeway 2. Lacking mortars and machine guns, Welsh devised a flanking maneuver through flooded terrain. Soldiers waded through water chest-deep for nearly 300 yards to reach the enemy from an unexpected direction. The assault relied entirely on the element of surprise rather than superior firepower. 12 German soldiers were killed and 23 captured, enabling Welsh's group to secure the western approach to the causeway. The position was held against repeated German counterattacks for 4 hours until reinforcements arrived from Utah Beach. Welsh would continue to lead Easy Company throughout Normandy, Holland, and Bastogne, eventually earning distinction as one of the 56th Regiment's most highly decorated officers. His decisive actions on D-Day established a model of small unit aggression that would define airborne operations throughout the European campaign. The glider assault commenced at 0400 hours, with Waco CG-4A gliders released from C-47 tow aircraft at an altitude of 600 feet. Each glider transported 13 soldiers, or equivalent weight in equipment, including jeeps, anti-tank guns, ammunition, and medical supplies. Landings were conducted in small Mormon fields, enclosed by centuries-old hedgerows and bordered by trees reaching 50 feet in height, leaving pilots mere seconds to locate suitable terrain and execute high-risk landings at approximately 60 miles per hour. Flight Officer John Lowther piloted Glider Number 7, carrying a surgical team from the 326th Airborne Medical Company. Upon reaching release altitude, Lowther observed that his designated landing site was obstructed by wreckage and burning gliders. He maneuvered sharply to identify an alternative area, but enemy fire tore through the glider's fabric and shattered the plexiglass nose, wounding him in the shoulder. Co-pilot, Flight Officer Paul Zetro, assumed control as Lowther collapsed across the controls. Spotting a small field bordered by stone walls, Zetro executed a side slip to reduce altitude and intentionally ground-looped the glider to dissipate speed. The aircraft hit the ground at roughly 40 miles per hour, skidding laterally across wet terrain, with the left wing shearing off against a hedgerow and the fuselage splitting behind the cockpit. Despite the damage, The surgical team survived with minor injuries and promptly set up an aid station that treated 183 wounded paratroopers within the next 24 hours. Colonel Howard Johnson commanded the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, noted for a leadership style marked by boldness bordering on recklessness. Known as Jumpy Johnson for his willingness to lead from the front, he landed precisely on Drop Zone D at 1:30 hours. However, he found himself nearly isolated, as his regiment had been dispersed across a 20-mile stretch of Normandy countryside.
By 0300 hours, Colonel Johnson had gathered only 150 paratroopers, a fraction of the 2,000 authorized for the operation. Opting not to wait for reinforcements, he initiated an assault toward La Barquette Locks, a strategic location controlling the flooding of the Douve River Valley, which was vital to German defensive plans. Johnson's improvised battalion encountered fortified German positions equipped with machine guns and mortars. Demonstrating personal courage, he led the attack himself, charging across exposed terrain with bayonets fixed. The German defenders, anticipating conventional tactics, were unsettled by the sheer ferocity and disregard for personal safety displayed by the small force. By 0500 hours, La Barquette had fallen, although Johnson's battalion suffered significant losses, 43 killed and 60 wounded. Despite their limited numbers, his paratroopers held the position for 2 days under repeated German counterattacks, sustained only by ammunition scavenged from fallen comrades. Johnson's leadership highlighted the aggressive spirit characteristic of airborne operations, turning a potentially disastrous landing into a tactical achievement. Private Donald Burgett, a 19-year-old from Detroit serving in Company A of the 506th Regiment, landed in a waterlogged field at 0117 hours. Having enlisted at 17 by falsifying his age, Burgett was dragged through water during his descent. He activated his emergency release to escape the harness, but his leg bag, containing essential rations and extra ammunition, was lost in the process. He reached shallow water with only his rifle, bayonet, and 4 grenades. Moving toward the distant sound of naval gunfire signaling the coastline, he discovered Private Robert Leonard trapped 20 feet up in a tree, suspended in tangled parachute lines. As German soldiers approached, Burgett climbed the tree and freed Leonard with his jump knife. Both remained motionless in the tall grass for 10 minutes as German troops searched the field. Despite a broken ankle, Leonard remained silent under extreme pain. Once the immediate threat passed, Burgett constructed a splint using rifle cleaning rods and parachute silk, and assisted Leonard over a 2-mile trek to a temporary aid station in a Norman farmhouse. Along the way, they neutralized 3 German soldiers and collected weapons and ammunition that Burgett would later employ during the capture of Causeway 1. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Patrick Cassidy, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 52nd Regiment, landed near Furkerville at 0140 hours and quickly set up a battalion command post in a ruined farmhouse. By 0300 hours, he had assembled 225 paratroopers and organized them into provisional units based on the weapons they carried rather than their original assignments. Machine gun crews were formed from personnel with ammunition, and bazooka teams paired operators with ammunition carriers, regardless of prior unit structure. Cassidy's target was the northern exit of Causeway 4, defended by 2 German companies supported by artillery. Instead of a frontal assault, Cassidy executed a double flanking maneuver while maintaining a central demonstration. The ruse successfully diverted German attention, allowing paratroopers to strike from the rear. By 0630 hours, the position had been secured with minimal American casualties. Cassidy's battalion captured 147 enemy soldiers and 4 artillery pieces, which were subsequently turned against German positions. His methodical approach preserved combat strength and maintained unit cohesion,
providing a structured backbone that connected dispersed airborne elements into effective operational forces during D-Day. To further complicate landings, Rommel had ordered obstacles to be placed in Norman fields, hindering glider operations and complicating the airborne assault. The landing zone, designated RML, was defended by a series of 12-foot-tall stakes, some interconnected with wire and others rigged with mines, designed to disrupt incoming gliders. Pilots were confronted with highly hazardous conditions, necessitating abrupt evasive actions at speeds typical for landing. Glider number 47 carried Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort, commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment. At 0410 hours, the Waco glider approached landing zone E. Pilot Charles Young struggled to maintain control as enemy fire severed critical cables. By the time the stakes came into view, it was too late to avoid them. The left wing collided with a pole, causing the glider to rotate approximately 90 degrees. The nose then dug into soft terrain, flipping the aircraft end over end. Vandervoort was propelled through the forward section, suffering a compound fracture in his leg. Despite the severity of his injury, he quickly established a command post and directed battalion operations for 3 days without medical assistance. Mounted on a commandeered motorcycle, with his broken leg immobilized against the frame, Vandervoort led the capture of Surlis and successfully repelled German counterattacks. His determination to remain in command despite debilitating pain motivated his paratroopers to extraordinary efforts. On June 7th, when German armored units threatened to break his lines, Vandervoort personally coordinated bazooka teams, achieving the destruction of 6 enemy tanks at ranges under 50 yards. Technical Sergeant Robert Neeland of Company D, 505th Regiment, landed precisely at Drop Zone O at 0130 hours. 25 years old and from Tonawanda, New York, Neeland was one of 4 brothers serving in World War II. His squad was tasked with defending positions near Neuville-Ploix. Moving through hedgerow country under cover of darkness, Neeland's platoon took defensive positions guarding the northern approaches, while the main body of the battalion engaged German counterattacks from the south. When confronted by 2 advancing German companies, the paratroopers engaged in fierce defensive combat. As daylight broke, Neeland and his men faced overwhelming pressure from enemy forces. Demonstrating exceptional courage, he chose to remain behind with 2 other paratroopers to provide covering fire, enabling his unit to withdraw safely towards Saint-Margals and ensuring the protection of 28 wounded soldiers and a medic. Neeland continued operating a machine gun for several hours under extreme duress. By noon, ammunition was nearly depleted, yet he persisted to allow his comrades to escape. He was ultimately killed in action at his weapon, his sacrifice securing the successful withdrawal of his platoon. His mother received word of his death simultaneously with news that another son, Lieutenant Preston Neeland, had fallen near Utah Beach on June 7th. A third son, Edward, had been reported missing in Burma, but was later confirmed alive in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. These family losses prompted the adoption of a sole survivor policy, which resulted in their remaining brother Frederick being withdrawn from combat duty. The glider assault on D-Day, executed at first light, was led by Major General Don Pratt, Assistant Division Commander of the 101st Airborne. The operation's planning and execution reflected the complexity and hazards of airborne landings under intense enemy resistance. At 0440 hours, Pratt's glider neared landing zone E, carrying crucial division staff and communications gear vital for coordinating dispersed units. The designated area bore the remnants of previous arrivals, smoldering vehicles and crashed gliders scattered across the terrain. Pilot Emile Matau conducted a careful survey, seeking any stretch of open ground suitable for touchdown. Only narrow openings between obstacles presented themselves. Opting for a hedge-covered field, Natal committed to the landing despite the visible presence of poles and wires. The aircraft impacted the Earth at approximately 70 miles per hour, far exceeding the space available. Natal applied maximum braking through the landing skids, generating sparks as metal scraped against stones. The glider collided with a hedgerow at roughly 40 miles per hour, crushing the cockpit and instantly killing Pratt. This event marked the loss of the highest-ranking Allied officer on D-Day, eliminating experienced leadership at a critical moment for the 101st Airborne Division's coordination efforts. Following Pratt's death,
Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kennard assumed command, establishing the division's operational headquarters in a farmhouse near Heissville, all while coming under artillery fire from German positions. The 57th Parachute Infantry Regiment suffered one of the most chaotic drops of the entire invasion. Intended to land at Drop Zone T, west of the Murderette River, the regiment instead scattered over marshlands, many of which were not visible in pre-invasion aerial reconnaissance. Private Edward Jesiowski found himself submerged in waist-to-chest deep water at 0240 hours. Weighed down by his equipment, he quickly sank. His parachute opened on the surface, trapping him beneath his canopy. Struggling against the silk, Jesiowski eventually freed himself, though the lines continued to tangle, preventing him from surfacing immediately. With burning lungs and fading vision, he inched along the parachute's suspension lines until he reached the edge, finally emerging into open water. Around him, the darkness was filled with the sounds of men drowning. Though he could hear desperate cries, Jesiowski managed to keep himself afloat. Over the next 3 hours, he navigated the marsh with his rifle as a probe to gauge depth. During this time, he assisted 2 fellow paratroopers caught in trees, nearly overwhelming all 3 with their combined weight, but eventually brought them to firmer ground. By dawn, he had gathered 11 survivors from multiple units, though none retained functional weapons due to immersion. The number of fatalities in the 57th Regiment remains uncertain, with estimates ranging from a handful to several dozen. Weeks later, bodies were recovered from the marsh, though identification was impossible after extended submersion. These losses were the result of flawed intelligence rather than direct enemy action, highlighting the brutal unpredictability of the operation.
Captain Ben Schwarzwalder, commanding Company G507, demonstrated remarkable adaptability under these conditions. A former West Virginia University football coach, he applied athletic principles to the tactical challenges of combat. Schwarzwalder himself landed in water too deep for movement at 0235 hours and immediately recognized the widespread dispersal of his men. Rather than risking a hazardous search in the dark, he quickly organized a rally point using a hunting horn he carried specifically for such emergency circumstances. His initiative helped mitigate the chaos and allowed the company to regroup under extremely adverse conditions. By 0400 hours on June 6th, the signal horn had summoned 43 paratroopers to the designated rally point. Under the leadership of Schwarzwalder, they were immediately organized into small fire teams, each allocated according to the weaponry available. These teams established overlapping fields of fire around a Norman farmhouse, creating a defensive network capable of resisting an enemy assault. When German forces attacked at first light, the paratroopers maintained their positions, exercising strict fire discipline. Schwarzwalder emphasized controlled, precise bursts of fire, instructing his men to choose targets carefully and conserve ammunition while inflicting maximum casualties on the attackers. Over the course of the day, the farmhouse became a gathering point for isolated paratroopers from various units scattered across the battlefield. By evening, Schwarzwalder was commanding 186 men drawn from 12 different units. He quickly consolidated these forces into an ad hoc company and, on June 9th, led them in the capture of the Lafayette Bridge Causeway. This action secured a critical approach, enabling American armored units to advance along the western route. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Cannonball Krauss of the 3rd Battalion, 505th Regiment, had been assigned the objective of taking the town of Smigels. Known for his aggressive tactics during previous campaigns in Sicily and Italy, Krauss refused to delay for reinforcements, despite his force of 97 paratroopers facing roughly 100 German defenders. He divided his troops into 3 assault groups to attack the town simultaneously from multiple directions. The operation commenced at 0430 hours, with grenades thrown into German strongpoints in and around the town square. Paratroopers systematically cleared buildings using automatic weapons and close-quarters combat techniques. A church within the town, where Private Steele had previously hung, became a fortified position. Troops set up machine guns in the steeple, using it to dominate the surrounding area.
The German defenders, overwhelmed by the coordinated assault from several axes of attack, withdrew toward Carrington, leaving behind weapons and equipment. By 0500 hours, Krauss had raised an American flag over the town hall, marking the first Allied flag to fly over liberated French territory. Securing Smiegels, however, proved far more difficult than capturing it. German counterattacks began around 900 hours, supported by infantry and self-propelled artillery. Krauss's battalion, already depleted, faced forces roughly 10 times its size, defending a perimeter that stretched beyond its capacity. Private William Tucker, positioned at a roadblock south of the town with 6 other paratroopers, confronted incoming German armored vehicles at 1400 hours. Lacking formal anti-tank weapons, Tucker improvised by filling captured wine bottles with gasoline to create improvised incendiary devices.
When the leading assault gun approached, Tucker climbed onto its deck and poured burning fuel into the vehicle's open hatches, forcing the crew to abandon it. He replicated this feat twice more, destroying 2 additional vehicles, before shrapnel from an 88mm shell severed his left arm at the elbow. Despite this catastrophic injury, Tucker continued to engage the enemy, firing his rifle one-handed until reinforcements from tanks arriving from Utah Beach relieved him at 1700 hours. His defense delayed the German advance for 3 critical hours, preventing the recapture of St. Marie. The German 158th Grenadier Regiment launched the first organized counteroffensive against American airborne positions at 0600 hours. 2 infantry battalions, accompanied by assault guns, advanced from Monteborn towards Smiegels. Anticipating such maneuvers, General James Gavin had positioned small blocking forces along likely enemy routes. However, the scattered nature of the paratroopers allowed only isolated strongpoints rather than a continuous defensive line. German forces were able to maneuver between these positions, threatening to cut off forward elements. Sergeant Otis Sampson held an outpost north of Smiegels with 10 men and a single machine gun. At 0630 hours, his position was overwhelmed by 2 German companies. Sampson ordered his men to retreat while he remained behind to cover their withdrawal. Alone, he operated the machine gun for 20 minutes, inflicting an estimated 30 casualties on the enemy before exhausting his ammunition. When German forces eventually captured the position, they discovered Sampson lifeless beside his weapon, surrounded by spent cartridges and discarded ammunition containers. His determined stand had stalled the German advance long enough for Gavin to establish a fallback defensive line. By 0800 hours, the 158th Regiment reached the outskirts of Mary-Glise, but was confronted by Sherman tanks moving inland from Utah Beach. The German offensive collapsed under the coordinated efforts of armored and infantry units, leaving approximately 450 casualties in its wake. Supplying the scattered airborne troops required exceptional improvisation. On June 7th, transport planes attempted resupply missions, but the absence of functioning radio beacons and clearly marked drop zones rendered accuracy nearly impossible. Operation Memphis, aimed at the 101st Airborne Division, dispersed supplies over an area of nearly 40 square miles. Paratroopers could only watch as vital ammunition and medical equipment fell into enemy hands or sank into waterlogged fields. Captain Frank Strabel led improvised retrieval efforts, enlisting French civilians and repurposing captured German vehicles. Despite these efforts, less than a third of the dropped supplies were recovered. Competition with German patrols for the same resources frequently erupted into armed skirmishes, as both sides understood the critical importance of the material. Facing severe shortages, American paratroopers resorted to extraordinary measures. They scavenged ammunition from fallen German soldiers, converting captured weapons when their own rounds were depleted. Medical supplies were recovered from enemy aid stations, sometimes under fire from their original occupants. Private First Class Joseph Lesnoy emerged as a pivotal figure in sustaining his unit through aggressive scavenging. A former factory worker from Michigan, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to locate and repurpose resources. Among his achievements, he recovered a German field kitchen that sustained 60 paratroopers for 3 days and discovered a marked ammunition cache that replenished machine gun stocks. His most consequential find came on June 8th, when he located an abandoned German medical truck containing surgical tools, morphine, and bandages. Using the vehicle, he supplied 3 aid stations while wearing German insignia, twice passing through enemy checkpoints by posing as a captured driver under guard. These efforts saved numerous American lives. Casualties mounted steadily across the Cotentin Peninsula throughout June 6th as dispersed engagements continued unabated. The 101st Airborne Division reported 1,240 casualties, comprising 182 killed, 557 wounded, and 501 missing, many of whom drowned in the flooded fields and were not recovered for weeks. The 82nd Airborne Division sustained 1,259 losses, including 156 killed, 347 wounded, and 756 missing. These figures reflect confirmed losses only, with hundreds more paratroopers unaccounted for, operating in isolated pockets and engaging in localized combat against German forces. Aircraft losses were substantial. 42 C-47 transports were destroyed, each carrying 5 crew members and up to 18 paratroopers. Additionally, hundreds of gliders were wrecked during landings, their fragile wooden construction offering little protection against enemy fire or collision with obstacles on the ground. In total, the combination of heavy casualties, supply shortages, and equipment losses exemplified the extreme challenges faced by airborne forces during the initial phase of the Normandy invasion, requiring improvisation, resourcefulness, and extraordinary courage to sustain operations under continuous enemy pressure. The reported number of casualties did not fully reflect the strategic achievements of the operation. Roughly 13,000 American paratroopers were deployed over a stretch of 60 miles under German control, sowing widespread confusion behind enemy lines. These forces captured key causeways, disrupted communication networks, cut off reinforcement routes, and severely hindered the German ability to respond to the amphibious landings. While General Eisenhower had anticipated up to 80% losses among the airborne troops, actual casualties remained below 50%. The losses were substantial but sustainable, and more importantly, the primary mission objective, delaying German reserves from reaching the invasion beaches during the critical initial hours, had been successfully accomplished. Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch assessed the operation from the cockpit of his damaged C-47 as it limped back to England. 2 engines continued to operate while 1 propeller was feathered due to flak damage. Hydraulic lines had been severed, leaking vital fluid, and his radio operator had been killed instantly by shell fragments that penetrated the fuselage. Despite these challenges, Crouch had successfully delivered his Pathfinder teams. The seemingly disorganized nature of the drops, which initially suggested failure, had in fact contributed to a remarkable tactical success. German commanders struggled to determine the location and scale of the main effort, which disrupted their ability to mount an effective defense. The conventional calculations of airborne warfare, emphasizing precise drop zones for unit cohesion, had been simultaneously validated and contradicted. Although scattered landings risked disorder, in this instance, small units operating independently generated an outsized psychological and tactical impact.
In contrast, military leaders such as Executive Officer Williamson aboard the USS England relied on meticulous planning and technological advantage to achieve their objectives. Airborne operations, by comparison, demonstrated that chaos combined with initiative could produce results equal to or exceeding even the most calculated efforts. The liberation of French territory had commenced amid darkness, uncertainty, and the inherent hazards of parachute insertion. Soldiers trained for coordinated maneuvers instead engaged in dispersed and improvised engagements. Yet through resilience and resourcefulness, these fragmented groups adapted, reorganized, and accomplished their missions. By the morning of June 7th, surviving paratroopers had regrouped into functional combat units. Scattered teams consolidated into provisional battalions. Isolated strongpoints were connected into defensive networks, and radio communications gradually restored command structures. Units that had effectively ceased to exist during the night of June 5th had been reconstituted solely through determination and adaptive leadership. Colonel William Ekman observed the advance of tanks from the 4th Infantry Division in the town square of St. Mary-Glise on June 7th. His 505th Regiment had successfully defended the first liberated town in France against repeated German counterattacks. The integration of airborne and seaborne forces was now complete, yet the human cost was undeniable. Ekman's regiment had initially comprised 2,560 soldiers, but fewer than 700 were present and accounted for. Many were casualties, either killed or wounded, with the injured occupying local aid stations set up in barns and farmhouses. Numerous others remained unaccounted for, dispersed among other units or in hiding from German patrols. Despite the severe attrition, the operation demonstrated that airborne forces could transform adversity into strategic advantage. Scattered landings, high casualties, and chaotic conditions, rather than undermining the mission, produced effects that no conventional calculation could have predicted. By leveraging adaptability, initiative, and sheer determination, the American airborne troops achieved a decisive foothold in Normandy, setting the stage for the broader liberation of France. The colonel observed a Frenchwoman placing flowers on the remains of a paratrooper who had fallen during the night's engagement. Her hands trembled as she laid the blooms, her tears marking the loss of a young American soldier who had died bringing liberation to her village. This scene unfolded repeatedly across the region as local civilians emerged from cellars to confront both the devastation and the freedom left in the wake of the invasion. The liberators were visible as both protectors and casualties of war. Private John Steele returned to the church he had clung to during the D-Day airborne assault. The injury to his foot from shrapnel had mended, yet a lingering limp remained as a reminder. The commemorative dummy paratrooper that would one day hang from the steeple in his honor was decades away. For now, only the memories of fallen comrades populated the square below. Removing his helmet upon entering the sanctuary, Steele noted the bullet-ridden walls and the stained floors where the wounded had been treated. Morning sunlight filtered through shattered windows, illuminating particles of dust that floated like miniature parachutes in the golden beams. He knelt in a pew, not from religious conviction, but out of sheer fatigue and the weight of witnessing history firsthand. Suspended between survival and mortality, the events of that day would haunt him for the next 25 years.
On June 8th, General Eisenhower toured positions held by the 82nd Airborne Division near Smeagol. At a makeshift aid station, Technician 5th grade Eugene Darnell was still attending to wounded soldiers after 3 consecutive days without sleep. "How are you holding up, son?" Eisenhower inquired. "Still upright, General," Darnell replied without raising his eyes, focusing on a chest wound. Eisenhower observed the medic's exhausted hands, shaking from fatigue but steady on injured flesh, a testament to the harsh reality of airborne operations. Far from the romanticized image of soldiers descending from the sky, these young men endured relentless conditions, performing impossible tasks simply because the situation demanded it. The Supreme Commander had approved the airborne assault despite the known hazards. He had personally accepted full responsibility should the operation fail, aware that dispersed units risked piecemeal destruction. Yet those same scattered forces achieved strategic surprise, proving decisive to the success of the invasion. The experience would influence military doctrine for decades. While massed strength remained a core principle, the judicious use of disorder could magnify the impact of elite forces operating behind enemy lines, allowing small units to generate results beyond their size through initiative and aggressive action. By June 10th, the 2 airborne divisions had linked with advancing forces from the beaches, consolidating control over key terrain. The 101st Airborne secured the southern section of the Cotentin Peninsula, protecting the right flank of the 7th Corps, while the 82nd held the central sector, defending critical road junctions and river crossings. The paratroopers who had jumped on June 5th had been irreversibly transformed. Combat under such extreme conditions,
Alone, in darkness, against numerically superior opposition, imbued survivors with a hardened confidence that would carry them through the remaining 11 months of fighting across Europe. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers, whose individual actions had taken out multiple German bunkers, never spoke publicly of his feats. When questioned, he would only remark, "I did what needed doing." Yet his nights were punctuated by nightmares, each one recalling the violence and terror of that evening. The price of extraordinary courage in battle was measured not just in medals or recognition, but in the enduring personal toll on those who had witnessed the chaos and death firsthand. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole commanded his battalion across France until he was fatally struck by a sniper in the Netherlands on September 18, 1944. While his Medal of Honor citation highlighted his bold bayonet assault at Carentan, it could not convey the intense resolve that propelled him forward in the face of overwhelming danger. In that moment, retreat was not an option. Only decisive action could continue the mission. Private Donald Burgett survived the conflict and returned to Detroit, where he pursued work in automotive factories and chronicled his experiences in airborne operations. His memoirs vividly conveyed both the terror and exultation of parachute combat, the deep bonds forged among soldiers, and the heavy toll paid by teenagers thrust abruptly into the machinery of global war.
Technical Sergeant Frank McKee earned a battlefield commission for his valor on D-Day and concluded the war as a captain. He frequently recalled the isolation of the initial hours, alone in a walled garden while battles unfolded beyond his sight. That experience impressed upon him a critical lesson. Warfare ultimately comes down to individual soldiers confronting impossible situations and making split-second decisions under pressure. The two airborne divisions would be called into action again in September 1944 during Operation Market Garden, the ambitious but unsuccessful effort to seize Holland's key bridges. They later held Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, securing a place in history for their defense of the encircled town. In March 1945, they executed another river crossing over the Rhine, the final major airborne operation in Europe. Yet none of these would rival the intensity of those early June nights over Normandy. On June 6, 1944, roughly 13,000 American paratroopers descended into darkness, each confronting personal fear as they fell. Their parachutes, fragile silk canopies against the night sky, became symbols of hope and survival. Though many landing zones were dispersed, creating what appeared to be tactical chaos, the effect was strategically decisive. German commanders, unable to predict patterns amid the confusion, hesitated at critical moments, providing the assault forces with the window needed to establish the beachheads that would fuel the liberation of Western Europe. Colonel Joel Crouch, who retired from the Air Force in 1962, kept a photograph on his desk for decades, a C-47 lined up at North Weather, pathfinders preparing to board for the flight to France. In those faces, he saw anticipation, anxiety, and innocence, unaware that within hours they would be scattered behind enemy lines. Crouch often reflected on the weight of responsibility he carried that night, knowing he had delivered these young soldiers to their uncertain fates. Some would die on landing, others would fight in obscurity, and a few would emerge as celebrated heroes. Yet most simply performed their duty under extraordinary conditions, proving the effectiveness of airborne tactics through courage and audacity rather than sheer numbers. At Smer Egels, a memorial honors the paratroopers who fell liberating the town. Bronze plaques display the names of soldiers from across the United States who traveled thousands of miles to confront the enemy in Normandy. The dummy paratrooper hanging from the church steeple symbolizes the precarious line between life and death, a tribute to those moments of suspended uncertainty. The deeper legacy, however, lies in the freedom their sacrifices secured, French children growing up beyond the shadow of occupation, and American families spared the prolonged suffering of drawn-out war. Each young man who survived contributed to the rebuilding of post-war society.
The high casualty rates predicted for airborne operations, around 80%,
proved less severe in practice, approximately 50%, yet still represented immense loss. Each percent accounted for dozens of men returning home to shape the post-war world. Their survival hinged on aggression, quick thinking, and the unyielding drive of soldiers who had no alternative but to move forward. In the decades following D-Day, airborne operations evolved with helicopters, precision-guided weapons, and new doctrines. Nevertheless, the fundamental principle established over Normandy remained. Small, highly trained units deployed behind enemy lines could achieve outsized effects by exploiting disorder. Chaos became a weapon when mastered by disciplined soldiers. The legacy of those early paratroopers endures in every soldier who has since earned the Golden Wings. Their courage over Normandy demonstrated that dispersed units, acting with initiative, could overcome formidable defenses and alter the course of history. On that night, American paratroopers did not simply descend from the sky. They transformed fear into decisive action. Through scattered drops and fragmented landings, they sowed the seeds of liberation, opening the path for the largest amphibious invasion in history. By the dawn of June 6, 1944, boys aboard C-47s had entered the crucible of combat and emerged as men whose choices would shape nations. Their courage in darkness illuminated the path to victory, proving that even amid disorder, resolve and initiative could prevail. Each parachute that touched down in occupied France marked another step toward freedom, a testament to the enduring power of determined individuals in the theater of war.